esteemed law professor Alan Dershowitz, professor emeritus of Harvard Law School. He joins us this evening from Miami. Professor Dershowitz, thank you for joining us. You've proposed a compromise on these judicial reforms so far, not accepted by the sides. President Herzog has weighed in with his own version, which goes maybe of the compromise that goes a little further than yours towards what the government wants. What do you think of more or less of President Herzog's proposals?
Well, first of all, no compromise will succeed because both sides are now winning with their base. Why should they compromise? The left had been dead in the water. The Labor Party couldn't get any votes. Now they're very popular. They have demonstrations on the street. The right is winning. The only people that are losing are the people of Israel. And I have to tell you, I've spoken to a lot of the people who are involved in these demonstrations, Americans. They have no idea what's going on. They have no idea what judicial reform means. You know, I've been doing this 60 years. I've never seen a protest about judicial reform. There were no protests when the United States packed the court, wanted to pack the court. This was all about trying to undo this election. This is all about Netanyahu. This is not about judicial reform. And so you're not going to get compromise over judicial reform because both sides are winning the debate with their extremes, and so we're not having a sensible approach. And the real problem is that it's destroying Israel's credibility. The people of Europe, what do they care about judicial reform? If all the things that are being proposed, well, almost all of which I oppose, if all of them were enacted, Israel would be like Canada or England, and in some ways like the United States. This is not about democracy. This is overstated, exaggerated on both sides. And this is a crisis for Israel. And I think it's very important for people to listen to President Herzog. He is the person who is making the most sense. Whether you agree or disagree with the specifics, what he said is he's not there to propose specifics. He's there to bring people to the bargaining table. The left won't come to the bargaining table because they say you first have to stop bringing the laws to the Knesset. The right won't go to the bargaining table because they don't think that enough compromise, too much compromise, will hurt their position. So it's Herzog today who has the right approach, and I hope people will listen to him, but I don't think they will. I think this has the potential for doing extraordinary damage to what we've all worked for 75 years. What I fear is that the 75th anniversary of Israel will be a very, very bad event, a very, very dangerous time for the existence and survival of Israel, because nobody seems to care about Israel. What people care about is having their side win, and that's extremely dangerous.
Right. Let's talk about one practical consequence of that. You've expressed concern that if the weakening the Supreme Court, for example, could weaken the legitimacy of the judicial system here, perhaps opening Israeli soldiers up to the possibility of prosecution in international courts. The government is actually even going further, or at least some elements of it, trying to introduce a bill that would give immunity to Israeli soldiers for any actions in the field here. How concerned are you even now, even about that prospect coming to be?
Look, I'm very concerned. I'm not in favor of it, but in the United States, there is immunity for soldiers in the field. The United States, they had a debate several years ago called Invade the Hague debate, in which members of Congress, Senate, and the House said, if they ever dare to arrest a single American soldier, we're going to declare war on the Hague. No country wants to see its soldiers arrested. Look, I don't support that law, but if that law were to be affected, it would have no impact on the credibility of the Israeli system. Most countries in the world today do not have judicial review. Most countries in the world today have judges appointed by the political power of the government. Most countries in the world give immunity to their soldiers. So what we're talking about is Israel becoming like many other countries. I don't want that. I think Israel should be better than other countries and should be a better democracy. But this has nothing to do with Israel being a democracy or Israel operating under the rule of law. The exaggerations on both sides are destroying credibility of Israel and destroying Israel and making the defense of Israel far more difficult. That's why compromise is essential, and that's why compromise won't occur. Because both sides, the extremes on both sides, are now winning. And if you're winning, why give up? And that's why President Herzog, who speaks for all the people of Israel, and the vast majority of Israelis want to compromise. The vast majority of Israelis don't want the extremes of either side. But the extremes of either side don't seem to care at all about Israel or about how the people of Israel want. They just want to win. It's like the United States. The United States is going through the same extreme process, and it's been happening now for several years. And it's fascinating because we've seen extremism in the 30s and the 20s when the economy was terrible, when things were very bad. This is the first time in the last 100 years that we've seen extremism during good times, extremism during times when the economy is doing generally okay, when employment is doing generally okay, when Israel is fairly safe. There is no good reason for this extremism, except that people today seem to be inclined toward extremes. And what Israel needs is somebody who's willing to talk sense to both sides. And what Israel needs is people on both sides, rational people on both sides, being willing to sit down. We are not seeing that. And this is an extreme danger to Israel's survival.
Yeah, Professor Dershowitz, Owen Alterman in the studio. I want to play devil's advocate. How good to see you. Devil's advocate with one thing that you said, saying that the protests are, from the protesters' perspective, about undoing the election rather than the merits of the issues. As Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, has argued on television, in print, if these laws were to be enacted as they are being legislated right now, without any kind of compromise, the question to be asked is, what would stop the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, from passing a law just about anything? There would simply be no restraint because there is the override clause with 61 votes out of 120. Only the goodwill, as he puts it, of those parliamentarians, that would be the only break. I mean, I take your point that there are a handful of democracies that operate that way. But is it really true that most operate that way? And don't you think, from the perspective of many, many Israelis, that they can feel rightfully upset with a political system that would operate that way? Now, I agree with you. There could be compromises on the override clause. There could be compromises on some of these other provisions that might not be acceptable to everyone. But if the laws were to be enacted right now, people would feel that there are simply no breaks and no restraints on the Knesset. And that is something that people are very, very afraid of.
Well, and they should be. Israelis are spoiled because they had such an incredible judicial review and such an excellent Supreme Court. They've come to think of that as the usual way. But that's not the way it is in England. It's not the way it is in France. It's not the way it is in Italy. And I'm not talking about Poland, and I'm not talking about other countries that are verging on tyranny. I'm talking about New Zealand. I'm talking about Australia. I'm talking about not a handful of democracies, virtually every parliamentary democracy. The parliament rules. They have the last word. Even in England, which is beginning to get some degree of judicial review, nobody would ever dream of a British court doing what the Israeli courts have been doing since the 1990s. So Israelis are badly spoiled. And if all these things are passed, which I would be completely against, particularly the packing of the Supreme Court by political partisans, it would turn it into the United States. Look at the United States Supreme Court. Presidents pick it. A partisan Senate confirms it. And it's a disaster. And that's why the Israeli system is so much better. But the worst thing that could happen is that the judicial selection process would become like the United States, and judicial review would become like New Zealand and Australia, England, and to some degree Canada. Israel would become closer to Canada than any other country. And people are just talking nonsense extremes. And we have to come back to a common sense approach. As I say again, Israelis are spoiled as they think of the Israeli legal system as the Barak system. And Barak's a very close and dear friend of mine. I've known him since 1966. I think he's one of the great Israelis. But they think of the Israeli system as the Barak system and as the American system of judicial review. And they don't understand that even if all these things were to be passed, and it would be a terrible thing if they were, because it wouldn't compromise Israel's democracy. It just would compromise Israel's commitment to minority rights, civil liberties, free speech, due process, all of that. But I just think we have to start listening to President Herzog.